A campaign is only as good as its antagonist, and for D&D, this takes the form of a villain. Perhaps an evil warlock is summoning undead, an oathbreaker is seeking vengeance on the innocent, or a giant dragon is wreaking havoc on the kingdom. These are all fun things to go up against as players, but as game masters, we're the ones responsible for coming up with these big bad evil guys. And in a world of Critical Role, Dimension 20, and other professionally produced campaigns, it can be hard to keep up with our players' expectations of how big, how bad, and how evil our villain needs to be. So we're left with the question of, what makes a good D&D villain? Hello again everyone, I'm Bill, admin and instructor over on Alt-Roll, and today I want to go over what a villain is, how to make a villain according to the source books, and how to reveal them properly within a campaign. To get started with creating villains, we need to know what the source books define as a villain. While Wizards of the Coast don't give us a true definition like they do with other game systems, we can piece together our own definition based on the tools they do give us across the Dungeon Master's Guide. In the DMG, we can find two mentions of villains. In Chapter 3, Creating Adventures, and Chapter 4, Creating NPCs. In Chapter 3, under the section Elements of a Great Adventure, the DMG states that any adventure needs a threat, which can be a single villain or monster, a villain with lackeys, an assortment of monsters, or an evil organization. Whatever their nature, the antagonist should have goals that the heroes can uncover and thwart. On top of this statement, there are multiple sections in chapters 3 and 4 that talk about creating a villain as part of creating an NPC, which indicates that a villain is an NPC within your campaign. With these things in mind, we can say that a D&D villain is an antagonistic NPC that represents a threat within the campaign, working towards some goal that puts them in opposition to the adventuring party, thus creating the main conflict of the game. There's not just one type of villain you can use, however. There's tons of different villain types that you can use or come up with. To help organize them, I'll arrange the plethora of potential villain ideas into 8 general archetypes and define each one very briefly. First up is the anti-villain. The anti-villain is a bad guy that has sympathetic motivations or appealing characteristics. This is often created with the idea that the bad guy was originally a good guy in terms of their goal, but their methods are what makes them evil. An example of this would be a conquest paladin that wants to make the world a more peaceful place, but in order to do so, they want to conquer the entire world and rule over it themselves, since they're smarter or better than everyone else in their mind. After the anti-villain is the beast. The beast is a literal monster, which cannot be reasoned with or rationalized. These villains work well in horror or sci-fi games, and the easiest way to come up with one is to look at the monster stat blocks marked as beasts or monstrosities. One example of a beast villain could be a pack of dire wolves who are eating innocent villagers simply because the wolves are hungry and the villagers are easy prey. After the beast is the bully. The bully is a villain that's mean for the sake of being mean, and is a good, simple antagonist for lower-level games. One example of a bully villain would be a bandit clan who are extorting a local town simply because they're bored. Next up is the machine. The machine is similar to the beast, with the exception that the machine is a construct of unknown design. Machines are incapable of human emotion, and thus their methods may be evil because they don't understand these emotions. An example of this would be a Warforged trying to solve a food crisis by killing people it deems unnecessary. Up next would be the Mastermind. The Mastermind is the traditional villain who hatches a diabolical plan to achieve some goal. They're often portrayed as being more mental opponents than physical, and they tend to use lackeys or minions to do the heavy lifting for their schemes. An example of this would be a local noble using blackmail and intimidation to steal a local election and gain more status. After the Mastermind is Evil Incarnate. This villain is pure, unadulterated evil, serving as a traditional enemy or obstacle to the heroes. Its motivations are typically not nuanced or complicated, it's evil for the sake of being evil. An example of evil incarnate would be a pit fiend seeking to conquer the mortal plane because that's what fiends do, they're pure evil. After evil incarnate would be the henchman. The henchman might not look like a villain initially, but they are. Essentially, the sidekick to a main villain, the henchman can lead the party towards discovering a greater villain by defeating this one. An example of this would be a cult leader who's working for an eldritch horror to try to summon them to the mortal plane so that they can consume the world. Lastly, we have the fanatic. The fanatic is driven by their extreme ideology, propelled by some twisted moral or religious motivation. An example of a fanatic would be a death domain cleric who worships their god of death so much that they seek to kill innocent people to appease their god. Now, these are just general archetypes, and you can always add nuance to these for more flavor to your villain. Perhaps your henchman is also a fanatic, but they also happen to be working for a mastermind villain that happens to also be evil incarnate. You can mix and match these archetypes to fit your idea of what your villain is, but sticking with just one archetype helps keep your villain's goals and motivations simple and straightforward. So, the Dungeon Master's Guide has told us what a villain is, and we have some general ideas for the types of villains that we can make. But now we have to dive into the hard part, actually making one. To make a villain, just like any NPC for D&D, we'll want to answer the 5 W's and 1 H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Luckily for us, the DMG does give us some suggestions, tools, and tables to try and make this easier. In Chapter 3, under the section Identify Important NPCs, the DMG gives us various tables to help come up with an initial idea for the NPCs in our game, such as allies, patrons, and villains. This table is meant to answer the who question, and using it, we can either roll a d20 to determine who or what our villain is, or we can take inspiration from these ideas to create our own. Below those NPC tables is the Event-Based Adventures section, which determines what your villain will do in your game, with a random dice table for the villain's actions shown here. This section is meant to answer the what and when questions, establishing a timeline of what the villain's planned actions are and when they would occur, assuming there's no interference from the party. Here again, we can roll on this table to randomly determine what our villain's scheme is, or we can use what's listed as inspiration for our own ideas. To answer the where question, we need to jump all the way over to Chapter 5, titled Adventure Environments. This entire chapter is dedicated to fleshing out the various dungeons, wilderness, and urban areas that may pop up in your campaign. While we have courses on Alt-Roll that go into great detail explaining how to design dungeons, wilderness, and cities, the only things you'll need to concern yourself with regarding the where question is, where is the villain's scheme going to take them? They might move around, they may have a central base of evil located in a dungeon, or they could live in a palace above the main city the campaign takes place in. Regardless of what you come up with, you'll want to link the locations of your adventure to the villain and their schemes in some way. Chapter 5 does contain numerous random dice tables to use regarding location creation, and as always, you can roll on them or just use them as inspiration for your own ideas. Finally, jumping back a bit to Chapter 4, Creating NPCs, the Villains section adds more detail to your big bad evil guy by determining what their objective is in detail, what methods they'll use to achieve that goal, and what their potential weakness is that the players can exploit. At first glance, this section just re-answers the what question. But in actuality, these tables are meant to answer the why and how questions. The villain's objective is intertwined with why they want it, and their methods lay out exactly how they're going to try and get it. These tables are unfortunately too big to show in one image without making everything super tiny and hard to read, but once again, they can be rolled on to randomly answer these questions or be used as inspiration for our own ideas. So to recap, to create a villain for D&D, you'll need to determine who they are, what they want, when they will accomplish their goal, where their goals will take them, why they want to achieve their goal, and how they plan on accomplishing their goal. So that was a lot of tables and definitions, which might be leaving you a bit more confused than when we started. So I want to make this a little easier to understand. Let's go ahead and show this process by making our own villain using these methods from the DMG. The first step would be creating who the villain is. So in Chapter 3 of the DMG, I'll go to the Adventure Villains table and roll a d20. Let's say I roll a 17, which results with a villain that is a humanoid raider or ravager. Now, humanoid gives us a lot of leeway in what exactly our villain looks like, but personally, when I think of humanoid raiders, my mind goes to orcs, which we also happen to have a video on if you haven't seen that. Orcs tend to be the bully archetype of a villain. They are just mean, they bully other races, and they're just generally not nice. They don't get along well with others. So let's say our villain is going to be an orc, possibly even a war chief. And let's give him a quick name, so something like Brog. Now that we have our villain, next we establish what their scheme is. As stated before, in Chapter 4 of the DMG, we have those random tables that can create or inspire these ideas. Since our villain is a war chief, it makes sense that they would probably seek either power or mayhem. So I'll look into those sections and manually choose something that fits my ideas rather than rolling a d20. For example, let's say that Brog, as an orc war chief, wants to conquer the local region as their own. So now we have our villain, an orc war chief named Brog, and we have generally what his scheme is. He wants to invade a region and take it over. After we have this, we establish how Brog is going to achieve his goal. Again, the table in Chapter 4 works very well in giving various methods, such as assassination, agricultural devastation, impersonation, torture, warfare, and more. If I wanted to find a good method for my villain to conquer a region, I'll look at the methods table and try to find something that fits the scheme that I've already chosen. Given what I know about orcs, warfare seems to be their preferred method of achieving their goals, so I'll just have Brog's method for conquering the region be a full-scale orc invasion. So now we have a villain, we have their scheme, and we have the method to complete that scheme. But this isn't enough for a full-blown campaign. Now we need to connect the dots and add more details to make this engaging for our players. So, how will our orc raider conquer this region through invasion? Well, knowing what I know about orcs as raiders thanks to their lore, orcs tend to establish a lair to raid from, and then go out in smaller scouting parties to scope out targets. Once the scouts return, they report on the biggest target to plunder, and then the orcs will mobilize to attack that target. So, our villain scheme will have a few stages. Stage 1 is scouting the area. Brog will send out scouts throughout the region to determine where they want to raid. Stage 2 will be organizing the raid. Once the scouts return, the warband will begin organizing and growing to attack their target. Stage 3 will be the invasion. Once organized and ready to attack, the orcs will swarm on the region and destroy any opposition they come across. The reason I've separated these into different stages is to plan for which part of the story my players can interfere with the villain's scheme, and how the villain may react at these different stages. So for example, if my players start interfering during stage 1, that might have Brog react differently than if they try to interfere during stages 2 or 3. So, using the methods from the books and our own imagination, we were able to create a story about an orc war chief named Brog who's going to invade a region to conquer it as their own, threatening the local inhabitants. We haven't had to write what the region is, or what villages are here, or what other NPCs are here yet, but we already know the gist of the story we're going to tell with our players just by establishing our villains' goals and how they plan on achieving those goals. So now we know how to properly create a villain using the tools given to us in chapters 3 through 5 of the DMG. However, the last thing I want to discuss in today's video is the next step after creating your villain, introducing them in the game. Introducing a villain can be complicated, and it's no easy feat to master. All of this setup and prep gets wasted if your party has no idea who this person is or why they're doing what they're doing. So, we need to make sure our players know enough about our villain to properly hate them and form their own motivation to stop them. Over the course of an adventure, your players should slowly uncover the big bad evil guy's attitude and personality. There are plenty of ways to do this, such as having the party interact with the villain directly, uncovering communications to or from the villain to other lieutenants, seeing the carnage the villain has wrought on other innocent people, and many, many more. Exactly how you reveal your villain is going to be up to your personal DMing style, campaign premise, and what your villain is actually like. So different DMs will and should try different things. For example, how would we show our players the orc war chief that we created earlier? Well, Brog is planning on invading the region and is sending out scouts to find good targets. The party might come across a destroyed caravan or a raided farmstead during their travels. If they investigate the area, the party will find some tracks that lead them to the scouting party responsible for the attack, and then engage in combat with them. After the battle, the party can loot a parchment with some orders written in Orcish, and either decipher it themselves or take it to a linguist. Ultimately, they should figure out that the orcs they killed were only scouts, and that a bigger force is gathering at a raiding camp nearby at the behest of a war chief named Brog. By having our players see the carnage of Brog's minions, and knowing that they were acting on his orders, they now know that a villain exists and that something bigger is about to happen, prompting them to try and stop the invasion. As I said before, this part of creating a villain can be difficult. If you find that this is the part where you're struggling the most in your campaign prep, there are plenty of ideas out there in videos that other creators have made as well. Some of the videos that helped me when I first got started DMing will be linked in the description below, so feel free to check those out if you want to dive deeper and get other ideas and examples. So, after going through all of these topics and tables, does the Dungeon Master's Guide give us enough tools and tricks to make good villains? The answer to this is absolutely. Using the structure they give us to answer the important questions, and using the examples it gives as inspiration, chapters 3, 4, and 5 give us a lot to comb through as DMs looking to make big bad evil people. However, there's one aspect I haven't really mentioned yet, mostly because I wanted to save the best for last. Even if you ignore everything else we've gone through here today, the number one thing that determines whether you have a good villain or not is whether or not they are fun to play against. D&D is a game that we play to have fun. And while spending hours upon hours creating an intricately nuanced villain can bring enjoyment to some games, it is not required in order to have fun playing D&D. Some of the most enjoyable villains I've faced or created in D&D have been the ones that were just cartoonishly evil, but provided an obvious opponent to the players. If you don't think that's fun and you want your table to have a more complex narrative, that's great. So long as everyone at the table is having fun, then you're doing it right, regardless of complexity. But that is going to bring us to the end for this video. Next week, we'll be looking at a more slithery monster that all of you suggested on our Google form, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that video. If you'd like to join the Alt-World Discord to learn more about how to play D&D with live courses, or vote on which monsters you want to see broken down in our Monster Breakdown series, the link for that is in the description. If you want to support the channel and server, you can leave a one-time or recurring donation using our Ko-fi link. For now, that's all I had for you though. Thank you all so much, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.